The gentleman yields back. Mr. Raskin is participating remotely. Mr. Raskin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks so much, Madam Chair, for calling this really important hearing. Mr. Fontes, in your testimony, you talk about all of the security measures that Maricopa County had to undertake during the 2020 election, including bringing in a SWAT team where you were counting ballots in order to prevent for the possibility of violence or turmoil in the event that the armed protesters outside the building got in. Can you explain how the security situation and the threats you received affected your operations and the staff?
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. The threats really were certainly not anticipated, and they had a significant and severe impact on the staff. Some of the impact included folks having to deal with circumstances well beyond just what happened at the time. The anxiety, it was very difficult at some point after the election, once a lot of the threats and the protests outside of our building happened, to make sure that election workers would come back. Folks had to be escorted back and forth to their vehicles by armed guards of the Judicial Protective Services and the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. And it's just, it's not a normal situation when fully armed and fully armored SWAT teams have to be present, because that's what security officials recommend. When folks are outside armed with AR-15 style and AK-47 style weapons, essentially threatening to storm the building. And that's a kind of a stressful situation that no civil servant, no election administrator should ever have to deal with. But they came through. And I have to say again, I'm incredibly grateful to the tens of thousands of people across the country, but particularly my team at the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and Elections Department. They came through with flying colors under the worst situation.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you for your service. Ms. Ramachandran, you found, as part of this Brennan Center for Justice survey of election workers nationwide, that 1 in 3 election workers feels unsafe because of their job, and 1 in 5 say that their lives have been threatened in the context of their work. You spoke to a lot of elected officials in the drafting of this report. Can you explain what is going on out there? Are they afraid of the kind of violence that came to the House and the Senate on January 6th, where 140 of our police officers were wounded and injured and ended up in the hospital?
Thank you for the question. I would say that in speaking to numerous election officials, from members of both parties, by the way, we spoke to both Republican and Democratic election officials. Yes, the fear that they're feeling is actually very analogous to the fear that I imagine was felt on January 6th during those tragic events. And to my mind, the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th was actually a form of an attack on election officials, because the members of Congress were fulfilling their duty, their ministerial duty, to count electoral votes, and there was an attempt to interfere with that. So I think it's very analogous.
What was the role that social media has played in circulating and promoting these threats against election officials?
Who is that question directed to, Mr. Raskin?
Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Ramachandran, I'm asking about the role of social media disinformation in the circulation of threats and the creation of a climate of uncertainty and anxiety among election officials.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for that question. Many of the election officials we spoke to said that absolutely social media is playing a huge role in the dissemination of disinformation and therefore the instigation of these threats. So something could start with actually an innocent misunderstanding to be posted on social media and then get picked up by a prominent official, whether it's a television celebrity or a prominent election official, and then just spread like wildfire. And of course, election officials attempted to speak the truth on social media and in traditional media and educate voters about how votes were really being counted and how elections really work. But it's so difficult for them to compete with TV celebrities and, you know, even the president of the United States. They definitely need help in order to be able to communicate accurate information and combat that disinformation.
And sticking with you, what are your policy recommendations for protecting the security of election officials so they can do their jobs?
Well, in our report, we are recommending that Congress provide funding for physical security protections and trainings. So, for instance, many election officials we spoke with said that they received recommendations from the police to do things like set up a doorbell camera at their homes, but they just didn't have the money in their budgets to provide for that sort of thing. So we think financial support from both state and the federal government would be incredibly beneficial.
Thank you, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman's time